In 1976, the quiet town of Clarion, Missouri, is shaken when Pastor Elijah Hart vanishes without a trace just minutes before his Sunday sermon. With no signs of struggle and only cryptic clues left behind, the case goes cold and the church he once led falls into silence. But in 1997, 21 years later, a bundle of his handwritten sermon notes mysteriously appears on a stranger's porch in a nearby town. As investigators follow the trail of his final words, they uncover a hidden cellar beneath the old church, long-buried evidence of abuse, and a courageous act of sacrifice that reveals Elijah had never truly abandoned his flock. He'd been protecting them until his final breath. It was a crisp spring morning in Clarion, Missouri, the kind that usually brought families to church in their Sunday best, with the smell of lilacs drifting in from open windows and children chasing each other around the white picket fence out front. At First Baptist, the congregation gathered slowly, as they always did, exchanging greetings and settling into their pews beneath the stained glass windows that painted the sanctuary in soft blues and golds. The choir had already taken their seats. The pianist played the familiar intro to "How Great Thou Art," waiting for the creak of the pulpit door and the sound of Pastor Elijah Hart's footsteps across the altar. But he never came. At first, it was assumed he was delayed, perhaps tending to someone in need, as he often did. Sister Mary Ann whispered that maybe he was with old Mr. Pollard, who had taken ill the night before. But when 10 minutes passed, then 20, a murmur moved through the room. Deacon Wallace stood and glanced toward the side door that led to the parsonage behind the church. "I'll just check on him," he said quietly, though his voice betrayed the unease rising in his chest. The parsonage was unlocked, as it always was. Inside, the kettle still held warm water, and a slice of bread sat untouched beside a jar of peach preserves. Pastor Hart's Bible rested on the kitchen table, its pages marked for that morning's sermon. His shoes were by the door. His keys hung on the wall. Nothing appeared out of place except for the absence of the man himself. By the time the sun reached its highest point, search parties had already spread through the woods and fields. Sheriff Mallory walked the creek bed, eyes sharp for any sign of a fall or struggle. But there was nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, no note. It was as though Elijah Hart had simply ceased to exist between dawn and the ringing of the church bell. That afternoon, the sanctuary remained quiet. The choir never sang. The pews emptied slowly, with whispered prayers and anxious glances. And as the church doors finally closed, an uneasiness settled over Clarion that would never quite lift, not for days, not for years. In the days that followed Pastor Hart's disappearance, Clarion felt like a town suspended in breath. For nearly 3 decades, Elijah had been its moral compass, its quiet force of stability. He knew every child by name, visited the sick without being asked, and never once missed a sermon. He was not the kind of man to simply walk away. Folks tried to convince themselves there had to be an explanation, maybe an accident, a mental break, or some private emergency that pulled him away, but deep down, most knew something darker had crept in. By the end of that week, the Missouri State Police had taken over the investigation. They scoured the woods, dredged a nearby pond, and brought in dogs that sniffed through cornfields and abandoned barns, but the trail went cold by the church steps. His car remained parked out back, the driver's seat adjusted just as he always kept it. There was no note, no sign of struggle, no indication that Pastor Hart had planned to leave. The most chilling detail was the absence of his sermon notes. Every Sunday, he wrote them by hand, loose-leaf pages in clean block letters, usually tucked inside his worn leather Bible. That morning, the Bible had been left behind, but the sermon was gone. Marlene, his younger sister, arrived from Kansas City the following Monday. Her face was pale, eyes puffy from tears that hadn't stopped since she'd gotten the call. She moved slowly through his home, taking in the quiet that now felt suffocating. In his desk drawer, she found stacks of older sermons, bills paid on time, and a half-finished letter addressed to someone named Nathaniel. Most of it was unreadable, the bottom half torn away, but the part that remained unsettled her deeply. "I've carried this truth for too long. I know what happened in '63, and I can't ignore it anymore." The town wanted answers, but none came. Weeks turned to months, then years. Rumors blossomed into local legends. Some believed he'd uncovered something terrible and paid the price. Others claimed he'd lost faith and walked away from it all. But even as the town tried to move on, the memory of that Sunday morning stayed like a shadow in the pews. And the sermon no one ever heard remained the question that never stopped echoing. By early summer, the flowers that lined the walk to the church had wilted under the weight of heat and unanswered questions. Sunday service continued, with visiting preachers and local deacons doing their best to hold things together, but without Elijah, the heart of First Baptist felt hollow. The pulpit stood like an empty chair at the family table, and people stopped making eye contact when they walked past it. Sermons were shorter, songs quieter. Some congregants clung to hope, praying each morning that he'd walk through the doors with an explanation, while others whispered theories behind closed doors, their voices laced with guilt for even imagining foul play in a house of worship. Sheriff Mallory kept the case open, at least on paper. He took Elijah's photo down from the bulletin board in his office only after the edges curled and the tape gave way, but he never stopped carrying a copy in his desk. Every so often, someone called in a tip, a truck seen idling near the parsonage that morning, a stranger asking for directions, but they always ended in dead ends and disappointment. Marlene stayed in Clarion for the first year, keeping up the parsonage and organizing Elijah's remaining belongings, but eventually the stillness became too much. She packed a few boxes and returned to Kansas City, leaving behind the manila folder of his last sermons, the creaking floorboards, and the quiet that had swallowed her brother whole. The church elders eventually replaced the pastor, though none stayed long. Some said the building had changed since that spring, like it held something unfinished. By the early '80s, the town had stopped speaking Elijah's name aloud. His disappearance became a wound that healed over but never stopped aching. Kids growing up in Clarion would hear vague stories about a pastor who vanished and a sermon that was never delivered, though the details blurred with time. And yet, inside the sanctuary, behind the hymns and polished pews, that morning lived on. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of wind through the bell tower reminded the old-timers of the man who should have been there, standing in the soft glow of stained glass, asking his flock to open their hearts just one more time. By the time 1997 arrived, most folks in Clarion had stopped looking for answers. A new generation filled the pews at First Baptist, and the memory of Pastor Elijah Hart had settled into something more myth than memory. The parsonage had been converted into a Sunday school building, its rooms repainted, its history unspoken. Those who had known him still remembered his gentle voice and the way he used to stand with his hands clasped behind his back, listening more than he spoke. But even those memories had begun to fade under the weight of time and silence. Nearly 30 miles away, in the small town of Elkins, Missouri, a woman named Grace Tulliver stepped out onto her porch one April morning to find a stack of old papers resting neatly beside her potted tulips. The bundle was tied with twine, wrapped in a thin sheet of plastic to protect it from the dew. She assumed it was a school project or maybe something dropped off by a neighbor, but when she brought it inside and peeled away the covering, her breath caught. Each page was handwritten in steady, blocky script. At the top of the first, Sunday Sermon, April 18, 1976, Return to the Light. The name at the bottom of the final page stopped her cold, Elijah Hart. Grace wasn't from Clarion, but the name was familiar. She'd grown up hearing about the pastor who disappeared before giving his sermon, the one people said had vanished with God's word still in his heart. She sat down at her kitchen table, tracing her fingers over the pages. The ink had faded slightly, but the message was intact. It read like a farewell, but also a confession, woven through scripture and aching honesty. He wrote about darkness disguised as piety, about secrets buried beneath faith, and about the fear of speaking truths that might destroy what people believed was sacred. Grace didn't sleep that night. The next morning she drove straight to the local police station and placed the sermon in the hands of a deputy who had no idea what he was holding. Within 48 hours, Clarion's sheriff was on the phone, his voice trembling as he whispered the words no one had dared to say in years. Elijah Hart was reaching out, and after 2 decades of silence, it seemed he was finally ready to be heard. The moment the sermon pages reached Clarion, it was as if time folded back on itself. Sheriff Mallory, now gray-haired and close to retirement, stared at the bundle on his desk with a reverence usually reserved for Scripture. He ran his fingers across the edges, pausing on the handwritten title, "Return to the Light," and for a long time he said nothing. The handwriting was unmistakable. He had seen it before, years ago, when he'd flipped through Elijah's personal notes during the early days of the investigation. But these pages were new, or at least new to them, having somehow survived 2 decades of storms, silence, and memory. He called Marlene first. Her voice cracked as he explained what had been found. She didn't ask how or why the sermon had surfaced now. All she said was, he never would have let that morning go unfinished unless he had to. She returned to Clarion within days, holding the notes in her lap during the entire ride from Kansas City, eyes moving across each word like they were the last thing connecting her to the brother she had lost. The local paper ran the story under a modest headline, "Missing Pastor's Sermon Surfaces in Elkins." But the town knew this was more than a curiosity. It reopened something in people, something they had carefully sealed away. At First Baptist, pews once again filled with those who had sat in silence that morning in 1976. Some of them hadn't stepped inside the church in years. They came not for a service, but for the reading of a message that had been intended for them all those years ago. Marlene stood at the pulpit and read it aloud, her voice shaking on every third word. Elijah's sermon was not fire and brimstone. It was raw, personal, and full of unease. He spoke of faith worn thin by truth, of questions he had no answers to, and of a burden he could no longer carry in silence. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People stayed in their seats, quietly absorbing the weight of what had been left unsaid for so long. The town had buried its pain, but Elijah's words had unearthed it again. And though no one yet knew how the sermon had reached that porch, or what trail it might lead them down, there was no doubt it had come from a man who had never truly left. After the sermon was read aloud in that packed sanctuary, a hush fell over Clarion that didn't lift for days. People who had once speculated in whispers now found themselves wrestling with a heavier truth, one that felt closer, more human, and far more painful than any of the old rumors. Elijah hadn't simply walked away. The sermon didn't say where he went, but it made something unmistakably clear. He had known something, and whatever it was had weighed so heavily on him that he felt he couldn't stay. Sheriff Mallory reopened the case officially, though the file had never been far from reach. He pulled it out from the bottom drawer of his desk and laid it across the table like an old friend he'd failed. Dozens of yellowed statements, photos from the parsonage, maps marked with red ink, and copies of interviews that led nowhere. None of it had changed, but the sermon cast every page in a new light, especially the unfinished letter to someone named Nathaniel. Deputies revisited that letter, this time with fresh eyes and clearer purpose. They contacted a handwriting expert in Springfield to compare the sermon with Elijah's known notes. It was a match. But more than that, the writing in the final paragraph held a subtle shift. The words became sharper, angrier, filled with urgency. One sentence, nearly lost in the fading ink, read, "The truth rots behind stained glass. They will not silence me forever." That single line stirred something in the sheriff. He ordered a search of the church, not the kind done with reverence, but with the steady hands of a man who'd waited 21 years for something to finally make sense. The sanctuary was examined inch by inch. Behind the choir loft, in a cramped storage room where old hymnals and folding chairs were stacked high, One deputy found a scuff mark on the floor that didn't match the rest. The wall behind it felt thinner, hollow in one spot, as if something had once been there, or still was. They didn't open it that night. The sheriff stood in the silence, fingers resting on the rough surface of the wall, heart pounding like a man hearing the echo of a long-forgotten knock. Whatever Elijah had hidden, whatever had driven him away from his pulpit that spring morning, might be closer than anyone had dared believe. They came back the next morning with tools, flashlights, and quiet resolve. The church was still empty at that hour, sunlight barely warming the sanctuary's stained glass windows. Sheriff Mallory stood just inside the old storage room with two deputies, all of them staring at the same section of wall the scuff mark had led them to. It didn't look like much, just worn wood paneling beneath peeling paint, but when Deputy Ruiz knocked again, the same hollow echo answered. It took less than 20 minutes to pry the panel loose. Behind it was a narrow cavity, just wide enough for a grown man to squeeze into sideways. A low draft of musty air poured out, carrying the scent of dust and old stone. The sheriff held his breath and stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through decades of darkness. The passage ran only about 12 feet, sloping downward into what looked like the base of the church's old bell tower, sealed off during renovations in the early 60s. At the far end was a small iron door, rusted shut but still intact. When they finally forced it open, what lay beyond stole the words from every mouth. A room, no larger than a shed, lay hidden beneath the church, cloaked in shadow and silence. Inside were the remains of a cot, a metal basin, and a wooden crate filled with empty tin cans and water bottles, each one labeled with a grocery brand that hadn't been sold in over 20 years. A single oil lamp rested on a crate beside a stack of old books, and something even more unsettling, charred fragments of paper burned in a rusted coffee tin. One deputy whispered that it looked like someone had lived here. Sheriff Mallory nodded, but his thoughts had already outrun his voice. If this was Elijah's hiding place, then he hadn't disappeared into the woods or vanished into the night. He had gone underground, beneath the very place he once preached. And if he lived here, even for a little while, then the story they thought they understood had been wrong from the beginning. Elijah hadn't abandoned his flock. He had gone into the shadows, perhaps to protect them, and he had done it alone. The cellar beneath the bell tower had no windows and no ventilation, aside from a thin crack in the stone wall where roots had crept through over the years. It was cold, even in April, and the silence felt unnaturally dense. Sheriff Mallory crouched beside the crate of charred papers, lifting a brittle edge of what used to be a page. Most of it had been reduced to ash, but a few scraps survived, fragments of scripture, a line about confession, and something that looked like a name, scribbled hastily and then crossed out twice. The deputies didn't speak. They just moved slowly, reverently, as if they'd stepped into a tomb. Behind the cot, tucked into the stone wall, they found something else. A hand-carved wooden cross, barely 6 inches long, fixed there with a single nail. It was crude, uneven, but unmistakably personal. Marlene arrived an hour later, her face pale as she stepped through the crawlspace. She paused at the threshold, her hand on the frame, eyes filling with tears the moment she saw the cot. "He was here," she said softly. "All this time, he was here." The sheriff didn't answer. He was staring at the oil lamp on the crate, next to a worn Bible missing its cover. Inside the front page was a familiar signature in dark ink: Elijah J. Hart. The man hadn't just hidden here, he had lived, prayed, and written within these walls. The longer they stood in that room, the more it became clear that this had been deliberate. Elijah hadn't run in fear. He had retreated with purpose. Later that afternoon, a deputy carried out a metal box they found, buried beneath a loose floor stone. It was sealed tight, rusted along the seams. No one dared force it open on the spot. They wrapped it in cloth, placed it gently in the trunk of the sheriff's car, and drove back in silence. Clarion had long accepted that Pastor Hart was gone, swallowed by mystery or worse. But now, with the cellar revealed and the sermon returned, it seemed Elijah had never truly left. He had stayed just beneath their feet, bearing a burden no one yet understood. Whatever lay inside that box might finally explain what had driven him into the dark, or it might raise questions even heavier than the ones they already carried. The metal box, once pried open at the sheriff's office under careful hands, offered no immediate answers, only silence thick with implication. Inside were yellowed envelopes, a bound leather notebook, and a small bundle of cassette tapes wrapped in cloth. Sheriff Mallory laid them out on the table one by one, as though assembling pieces of a long-lost puzzle. The tapes bore dates written in ballpoint pen, starting in late April 1976 and continuing sporadically into early 1977. The first envelope was addressed in the same steady handwriting to Marlene, in the event of my death. She sat across from the sheriff, hands trembling as she opened it. The letter inside was written with intention, words carefully chosen. Elijah explained that he had discovered something years before his disappearance, something he believed would unravel not just reputations, but faith itself, if revealed without proof. He had chosen to remove himself, to go into hiding beneath the church, while collecting evidence, he wrote, because he no longer trusted those around him, not even the elders he once prayed beside. His letter ended not with a farewell but with a plea that the truth be known, whatever the cost. The tapes were played slowly, cautiously, one at a time. Elijah's voice emerged, weary but composed, describing meetings he had overheard, confessions made behind closed doors, and a name he repeated more than once: Nathaniel Boone. A former deacon, Boone had left Clarion abruptly in 1963 under vague circumstances. Most believed it was a personal matter, an affair or a family scandal, but Elijah seemed convinced it had been something far worse. On one recording he said, "They buried the truth with hymns and handshakes, but I saw it. I saw the boy leave that room crying. I should have spoken then." The notebook confirmed what the tapes suggested. Detailed observations, dates, initials, all cataloged with methodical precision. It became clear that Elijah had been building a case from the shadows, too afraid to go public without evidence but too convicted to look away. The deeper they read, the more the story of Pastor Hart shifted from mystery to martyrdom. He had not fled from weakness or shame. He had chosen isolation as the only safe path toward exposing the rot beneath the surface. And now, 2 decades later, that truth was finally beginning to surface. News of the tapes spread through Clarion like a second sermon, this one not from the pulpit but from the depths of a hidden room, and it stirred a restlessness that hadn't been felt in years. Sheriff Mallory kept their contents close to the vest, knowing full well the weight they carried. The voices recorded were not just Elijah's, they included snatches of other men, clipped conversations he had captured from behind the church walls using a simple handheld recorder. In one, a gravelly voice whispered about putting it to rest, and how Nathaniel's departure was the cleanest solution. In another there was laughter, cold and casual, about a boy who should have kept his mouth shut. The sheriff brought the tapes to the state attorney's office by the end of the week. What had started as a small-town mystery was now officially an investigation. The name Nathaniel Boone appeared again in archived church records, but there was little beyond that. His departure in 1963 had been sudden and oddly undocumented. No forwarding address, no letters. No records beyond a one-line mention in that year's minutes. Deacon Boone stepped down for personal reasons. But Elijah had seen more. He had spoken with children at the time, now grown adults, whose names appeared in the margins of his notebook beside circled dates and phrases like "spoke in fear" and "coached testimony." Deputies made calls to neighboring counties trying to locate Boone or anyone who remembered him. Meanwhile, Sheriff Mallory sat with Marlene and played one more tape, the final one, marked January 2, 1977. Elijah's voice was slower here, like a man worn down by silence. "If you find this," he said, "then I trust the time is right. "I can't do it from down here anymore. My body's failing and I don't know how much longer I have. But God didn't call me to comfort. He called me to truth." Those words stayed with the sheriff long after the recorder stopped. Elijah Hart had not disappeared. He had descended into the earth beneath his church, determined to drag the truth into the light. And now, as old sins clawed their way to the surface, the town of Clarion would have to decide whether it had the courage to face what Elijah had already paid for in silence. Clarion, once so certain of its innocence, now found itself in a quiet reckoning. The sheriff's office received a steady stream of calls, some curious, some angry, and a few hesitant voices asking if it was true, if Pastor Hart had really been hiding under the church, if the rumors from so long ago had roots deeper than gossip. Sheriff Mallory answered carefully, not offering more than what had already been confirmed, but the weight in his voice told most of them enough. He knew the difference between speculation and truth, and this, at last, was truth rising from the dust. At First Baptist, there was discomfort that couldn't be preached away. The current pastor, Reverend Gordon, addressed the congregation with a prayer for healing, but many couldn't meet each other's eyes afterward. Some had been children when Boone served as deacon. Others had parents who once sat shoulder to shoulder with him during communion. Elijah's name, once spoken only in sorrow, now surfaced with reverence and regret, a man who had seen what others had refused to face. That week, one of the elders, Arthur Glenn, walked into the sheriff's office unannounced. He was thin now, his once powerful frame diminished by age and time, but his eyes were sharp. He sat across from Mallory without speaking for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and slid a small envelope across the table. Inside were 3 photographs, faded but clear, 2 of a boy sitting on the church steps in 1963, and the third of Nathaniel Boone shaking hands with a man in front of the old fellowship hall. On the back of the final photo was written in careful script, July 1963, the day we made it go away. Mallory didn't ask where the photos had come from. Glenn looked tired, like a man who had been waiting decades to finally exhale. "We thought we were protecting the church," he said quietly. "But all we did was protect a lie." The sheriff didn't offer forgiveness. He only nodded, knowing that this was just the beginning. With the box unsealed, the tapes heard, and the past rising from the foundation stones of First Baptist, Clarion had no choice now but to follow Elijah Hart's trail the rest of the way. And whatever they found, it would be too loud, too raw, and far too late to be buried again. The photographs changed everything. Sheriff Mallory scanned them again and again, studying every shadow, every expression, as if the grainy film could offer more than it had already revealed. He placed them side by side with the names from Elijah's notebook, drawing lines through history that had once seemed sealed tight. Nathaniel Boone wasn't just a name whispered in old letters or muttered on tapes. He had been central, woven into the church's leadership during its most vulnerable years. And now, with testimony growing and fragments falling into place, it was clear his sudden departure in 1963 hadn't been exile, it had been protection. Word reached the state investigators quickly. They had jurisdiction now, pulling old files, requesting birth records, and tracking anyone who might have crossed Boone's path after he left Clarion. The story was no longer just about a missing pastor. It was about children who had once been silenced, about men who had turned their heads, and about the slow, painful unraveling of a truth buried in sermons and hymnals. One of those children, now a grown man living in Illinois, came forward after reading the article in a regional paper. His voice trembled when he called, but his words were steady. He remembered Pastor Hart visiting him at a group home in 1977, asking quiet questions no one else dared to ask. He had never told anyone, afraid of not being believed, but he had never forgotten the man who'd knelt beside his cot and said, "You're not alone, and someday the truth will matter." His statement added another thread to Elijah's quiet investigation. The notebook had listed this boy's initials beside a page dated just days before Elijah's voice faded from the tapes. The final entry read, He remembers. He wept when I asked. I've written it all down. In Clarion, where the streets still looked the same and the steeple still rose over maple trees, people began to speak differently. They no longer whispered Elijah's name like a cautionary tale. They said it now with quiet reverence. The pastor who had vanished hadn't fled from fear. He had walked willingly into the shadows beneath his church, carrying with him not just a burden, but a calling. One that demanded the truth survive, even if he didn't. Marlene walked the church grounds alone one evening, just after dusk. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving the stained glass windows dark and hollow, their colors muted without the light. She stopped near the old bell tower, her gaze lifting to the steeple her brother had once climbed for quiet reflection. The air smelled of dew and spring pollen, but beneath it lingered something heavier history that refused to stay buried. She carried a small leather bag with her, inside it a copy of Elijah's final sermon, the first tape from the box, and a photograph of them taken as children, barefoot by the river behind their childhood home. She had returned to Clarion with a purpose now, no longer just Elijah's sister but the keeper of what remained. And what remained was a legacy too long misunderstood. Her brother hadn't left them. He had stayed in the only way he knew how, by documenting everything, by bearing the weight of silence so others might speak someday. Sheriff Mallory met her in the sanctuary just as she was placing the bag on the altar. He looked older now, like the years had caught up all at once. He didn't ask what she was doing. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the flicker of candlelight dance across the wooden pews. "We'll find Boone," he said after a long pause. His voice was low, steady. "Or at the very least, we'll make sure the boys he hurt are no longer forgotten." Marlene nodded, but her eyes didn't move from the altar. Elijah was trying to show them that the church could be a place of healing again, not through silence, not through hiding, but truth. In the coming weeks, the investigation expanded. More names surfaced. Former members came forward. Some wept. Others carried bitterness buried too deep for comfort. But they spoke, and in doing so, carried forward the work Elijah had begun in a cold stone cellar beneath the very building he had once filled with light. The town was changing, one truth at a time. And though Elijah Hart would never return to the pulpit, his voice through scribbled notes, broken tapes, and the people who finally listened had found a way to rise. The morning they reopened the old church archives, a slow rain tapped against the windows, soft and rhythmic like a breath long held. Down in the church's basement, beneath rows of hymnals and rosters coated in dust, they found the filing cabinets that hadn't been touched in decades. Sheriff Mallory, joined by a state investigator and Reverend Gordon, pulled drawer after drawer, searching for anything that might give weight to Elijah's notes. Most of it was routine baptism records, tithing ledgers, wedding licenses. But then they came across a slim manila folder, labeled with a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in Clarion for years: Nathaniel Boone. Inside were only two documents. The first was Boone's resignation letter, handwritten and dated July 18, 1963. It was vague, citing personal reasons and a desire to seek God's guidance elsewhere. The second was a single-page memo, unsigned, with the words "situation resolved quietly" scribbled in the margins. That phrase alone gave Mallory pause. The handwriting didn't match Boone's, and it wasn't in Elijah's style either. It seemed like an afterthought, a note made in haste by someone who thought it best not to leave a clearer trail. The state investigator took photographs of the documents and sealed the originals. They were now evidence in an expanding inquiry that stretched well beyond Clarion. Boone had resurfaced in records in Arkansas for a few years after leaving Missouri, working briefly at another small-town church before disappearing again. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, and for the first time, it looked like the men Elijah had tried to hold accountable might finally face the light. Back at the parsonage, Marlene placed fresh linens on the bed that had sat unused for decades. The room was quiet, the furniture sparse, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt like something had come full circle. She stood by the window, watching the rain beat against the glass, thinking of the mornings her brother used to sit with his coffee, notebook in hand, scribbling lines he'd later read from the pulpit. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for justice, not even for peace, but for clarity, for people to finally see her brother not as a mystery, but as a man who stood for something when standing meant losing everything. By late spring, Clarion had changed. It wasn't loud or sudden, but something in the way people spoke had softened. Conversations that used to trail off at the mention of Elijah Hart now leaned forward instead of away. More residents came to the sheriff's office to share what they remembered: small things, quiet conversations, odd looks exchanged in the fellowship hall, vague rumors that once seemed too fragile to repeat. Each account added weight to Elijah's old notes, confirming what had once been only suspicion. Sheriff Mallory compiled them into a growing case file, careful to cross-reference each story with the names Elijah had listed, each date with the scribbled entries in his notebook. It was during one of these interviews that a woman named Nora Hale stepped forward. She had been just 16 in 1963, a youth volunteer at the church. She remembered Nathaniel Boone clearly, his charm, the way adults seemed to admire him, and how children grew quiet when he entered a room. She never witnessed anything directly, but she remembered one boy, Thomas Lyle, who had stopped attending Sunday school abruptly that summer. When she asked about him, she was told he'd moved in with an aunt. Years later, she found out he hadn't moved at all. He had been placed in a group home out of state. She had always wondered why. Thomas, now in his 50s and living in Kentucky, was contacted by investigators. When he answered their call, his voice trembled. He had thought about Elijah often, he said. The pastor had visited him once, maybe twice, and told him something no one else had, that he believed him, that he didn't need to be afraid anymore. It was the only kindness he remembered from that time. He agreed to give a statement. What followed confirmed nearly everything Elijah had recorded. Boone had not only harmed children, he had been shielded by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The church elders knew, or at the very least, chose not to know. When Sheriff Mallory finished typing up the report, he didn't feel triumph. He felt tired. Tired in the way a man feels when he's carried someone else's burden too long. But that night, as he locked the file away, he whispered to the silence, "You were right, Elijah. You were right all along." A month after the sermon notes first appeared, Clarion received its first official notice from the state. The investigation had moved from preliminary inquiry to formal case, now carrying the weight of survivor testimony, audio recordings, and corroborating documents. Sheriff Mallory stood before the town council in the same chamber where Elijah Hart once offered invocations before local meetings. But this time, there was no prayer, only a quiet steadiness as he laid out the facts. A trusted deacon had committed unspeakable harm. Church leaders had looked the other way. And one man had vanished into silence, not because he was weak, but because he was willing to shoulder the cost of exposing it all. Marlene sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on the sheriff, clutching Elijah's worn Bible in her lap. Around her, townspeople who had once whispered theories in grocery store aisles now sat still, listening. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard the full story from someone who wasn't speculating. The weight of it hung in the room like humidity before a storm. When the meeting ended, no one clapped. No one stood. They just rose slowly, filing out as if leaving a funeral. That same evening, Reverend Gordon walked the perimeter of the church alone. The walls, once so familiar, now felt heavier somehow. He paused beneath the stained glass window Elijah used to admire, the one with the shepherd leading lambs through a thicket of thorns. It had been a gift from the congregation in 1963, the same year Boone quietly disappeared. Now it felt like a witness. The next Sunday, the sanctuary filled again, not with celebration but with acknowledgement. Reverend Gordon didn't preach from the pulpit. He stepped down to stand among the pews and read aloud from Elijah's journal. Not the sermon, not the notes. Just one entry, written in the margins beside Psalm 43. Speak the truth even if your voice breaks. Light only reaches the wounded places when the wound is no longer hidden. People wept openly, not for themselves, but for the silence they had accepted for too long. Clarion was beginning to understand that redemption didn't come through forgetting, it came through remembrance. And through finally, painfully, telling the truth. By mid-June, word had reached as far as Jefferson City. A formal request was issued to reopen records sealed in 1963, including those related to the abrupt resignation of Nathaniel Boone and other internal church matters previously marked as confidential. The Attorney General's office authorized the move, citing new evidence and the credible testimonies gathered in Clarion. Boxes long forgotten in a state records vault were pulled from dust and shadow, their faded labels bearing names that, until now, had escaped scrutiny. Among them was a file from the Missouri Children's Welfare Office, containing reports that hinted at misconduct flagged by a social worker more than 3 decades prior. The notes were brief, oddly inconclusive. One page stood out, an observation made after a brief visit to Clarion's parsonage in the fall of 1963. The social worker had written, "Subject child withdrawn. Physical signs not observed but behavioral concern noted. Caregivers present but evasive. Referral advised. No follow-up recorded. The child's name had been redacted." Sheriff Mallory handed the file to Marlene later that evening. They sat at her kitchen table, the cicadas humming through the open windows. She read the page over and over, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of the missing name. "He saw it," she whispered. "Even back then, Elijah saw it. But no one listened." Across town, Reverend Gordon had begun preparing a special service, one he never imagined leading. Not a memorial, but a reckoning. He invited survivors to speak if they wished. Some declined. A few agreed, their voices still raw, but ready. The service would be held in the sanctuary on the first Sunday of July, 21 years and 2 months after Elijah Hart vanished. He would not be there to witness it. But the truth he'd carried into darkness would finally have a place to be heard. And while Nathaniel Boone remained unaccounted for, the silence he had once counted on was collapsing. What Elijah could not do alone, the town was learning to do together. The walls that once hid secrets were now echoing with stories that refused to be buried. And each one was another step toward the light Elijah had written about in the sermon no one heard until now. The service began with no fanfare, no choir, no banners, no opening hymn, just the steady sound of people settling into pews, many for the first time in years. Reverend Gordon stood near the altar, not behind it, dressed simply, his notes held loosely at his side. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting softened reds and blues across the sanctuary floor, and there was a stillness in the room that felt sacred in a way no prepared sermon ever could. Marlene sat in the front row, her hands folded over Elijah's Bible. On the pew beside her rested the original copy of his final sermon, the one found on that stranger's porch, the one meant for a morning that never arrived. It had been read aloud weeks earlier, but today it would remain closed. This day belonged not to Elijah's voice, but to those he had tried to protect. The first speaker was Thomas Lyle. He stepped carefully to the front, his eyes never lifting from the wood grain beneath his feet. His voice was soft but sure. He spoke not of pain, though it lived in every word, but of the one visit that had given him peace. He sat next to me, not across from me, like he knew I didn't want to be looked at. He didn't ask what happened. He just told me I mattered, and I believed him. There was no applause, only silence, deeper and more honest than any amen. Others followed, some shared memories. Some could only offer tears. One woman simply placed a folded piece of paper on the altar and returned to her seat, her story too heavy for words. And still, the room held steady, not broken, but opened, finally opened. When the last voice faded, Reverend Gordon stepped forward once more. He did not preach, he did not summarize. He simply looked out at the faces before him and said what needed saying. That this place had failed, that silence had harmed, but that healing, if it were to come at all, must start in truth. Outside, as the crowd slowly filtered into the daylight, the church bell rang once. No hands pulled its rope. It swung gently in the breeze, as if stirred by something long buried, now finally set free. The Monday after the service, Sheriff Mallory received a call from a retired postmaster in a small town across the state line. He had read about Clarion in the newspaper and thought he recognized the name Nathaniel Boone. A man by that name had rented a P.O. box in their town for several years, beginning in the late 1970s. He kept to himself, never received packages, only letters, always paid in cash. The postmaster couldn't say for certain it was the same man, but there had been something uneasy about him, something that stayed with him all these years. The sheriff followed up immediately, forwarding the tip to the state investigators, who cross-checked property records and found a cabin deeded under a different name but connected to Boone's former employer. It sat deep in the Ozark foothills, remote, isolated, nearly forgotten. When agents arrived, the property was long abandoned, overgrown and silent, but what they found inside was enough to confirm he had lived there. Letters in Boone's handwriting, old church bulletins, and a photograph of First Baptist from the 1960s, curled at the edges from age. It was as though he had been watching from a distance, waiting or hiding. There was no sign of him now. If he was alive, he was in his 80s, perhaps sick, perhaps gone. But the discovery gave the case new life. Boone could no longer hide behind anonymity. His name, once omitted from the church's history, was now inked into court filings, broadcast on local news, and etched into the memories of those who had waited too long for someone to say it aloud. Back in Clarion, Marlene returned to the parsonage with a letter of her own. She wrote it slowly, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the Bible Elijah had once carried to the pulpit. She didn't address it to anyone. It was enough to know the words were there, tucked between pages of scripture and sorrow. That night, rain rolled through the town again, tapping gently against windows, soaking the church steps, washing over the bell tower's roof. And in the quiet of that storm, it felt just for a moment as if Elijah Hart's vigil had finally ended, not in defeat, but in the echo of a truth that refused to stay buried. Weeks passed, and though the investigation pressed forward, Clarion moved with a slower rhythm. The shock had settled into something quieter, something reflective. Families began to talk more openly about what had happened, not just with Elijah, but with the church itself. In living rooms and over coffee, stories that had once been too difficult to speak found air. Some were fragmented, half-remembered moments from childhood. Others came with clarity sharpened by time. And each one, no matter how small, helped the town stitch together the full shape of what had been buried beneath its pews for far too long. Sheriff Mallory spent his evenings reviewing statements, returning calls, and responding to reporters who now saw the story as more than just a local mystery. But in the quiet hours, his thoughts always drifted back to the cellar beneath the bell tower. That room, cold and narrow, had become the true pulpit from which Elijah Hart had delivered his final message. Not with his voice, but with his stillness, his documentation, and his refusal to look away. Marlene often found herself sitting on the back steps of the parsonage, just as she had with Elijah when they were children. The backyard hadn't changed much. The same maple tree still leaned slightly to the left. The same rusted swing creaked in the breeze. Sometimes she read from his journal, not the sermons, but the private entries, his doubts, his confessions, his love for the people he served, even when they failed to see him. There was one line she returned to often, scrawled in the margin beside a list of children's names. "If no one remembers, it happens again. I will remember." Plans were made to convert the old cellar into a memorial space. Not a shrine, but a room of truth. A place where Elijah's notes would be preserved, where his voice could continue to speak through the records he left behind. The congregation approved it without debate. It was the least they could do. And though the search for Boone continued, Clarion no longer felt helpless. The silence that had once protected him had been broken. In its place grew something new, something careful and earned. Not just justice, but understanding, and through that a kind of peace. In late July, a stranger arrived in Clarion. He was tall, mid-30s, with a tired look behind the eyes that made him appear older. His name was Daniel Reed, and he introduced himself quietly to the church secretary, explaining that he had driven in from Tennessee after hearing Elijah Hart's name on the radio. When Sheriff Mallory was called to meet him, Daniel sat in the back pew of the sanctuary, hands clasped, staring up at the stained glass as if trying to read something hidden between the colors. He told the sheriff he had been adopted out of the Missouri foster care system in the early 70s. He remembered only fragments from his childhood, pieces that never quite fit together until he heard Elijah's name. "He visited me once," Daniel said. "I don't remember everything, but I remember the feeling, like someone saw me for the first time." Marlene met him that afternoon at the parsonage. She offered him iced tea, which he declined, then brought out Elijah's journals and tapes. As Daniel listened, something in him shifted. He didn't cry. He didn't speak much. But when he opened the worn journal and found his name initialed and dated, he placed his hand over it like one might touch a gravestone. "He didn't forget me," he said, voice breaking under the weight of the years. "All this time, he didn't forget." The sheriff later confirmed that Daniel had likely been one of the last children Elijah had reached before he disappeared. His name, scribbled beside a note in Elijah's final tape entry, had been underlined twice. There was no detail, just a short sentence. "He still doesn't speak, but I saw the fear lift when I said his name." Daniel stayed in town for several days. He visited the cellar, now being carefully restored. He walked the fields behind the church. He sat in the sanctuary each morning without saying a word. When he left, he carried with him a copy of Elijah's sermon and a photograph Marlene insisted he take, the only one where Elijah wasn't in a suit, just smiling in the sun, sleeves rolled up, hands resting on his knees. It was a face Daniel had only seen once, through the haze of childhood, but it was a face he would never forget. The summer deepened, and with it came a quiet determination across Clarion. No banners were hung, no celebrations planned, but the town moved forward with purpose. Each week brought new layers of healing, slow, tentative, but real. The cellar beneath the church was nearly complete. Craftsmen worked carefully, preserving the stone walls and the crude wooden cot as they had been found. A display case had been built to hold Elijah's sermon notes, journal pages, and the small wooden cross he had carved and nailed above his bed. Marlene oversaw the project every day, arriving just after sunrise and staying until the tools were packed away. She didn't say much to the workers, only stepped aside now and then to stand in the room alone. Sometimes she ran her hand along the rough edge of the crate Elijah had used as a table. Other times she just stood in the middle of the space and listened, as if expecting to hear his voice echo up through the walls again. Sheriff Mallory received another lead in early August. A man fitting Boone's age and description had died in a nursing home under an assumed name in southern Arkansas. The fingerprints matched. It was him. There had been no obituary, no family. The man had passed away alone, and quietly, unaware that his past had begun unraveling behind him. There would be no trial, no confession, only the quiet certainty that the truth had finally caught up to the name Clarion had once whispered with uncertainty and dread. Mallory broke the news to Marlene gently, unsure whether it would bring relief or just another form of grief. She sat with it for a long time before replying. "I don't need his punishment," she said softly. "Elijah didn't wait for justice. He gave everything he had to the truth. That's what matters now." Plans were made to install a plaque near the cellar entrance. It would not glorify tragedy, nor list the names of those who had looked away. Instead, it would bear a single line from Elijah's journal. Carved into bronze, it would read, "Truth is the work of the living. I will do my part in silence, if I must." And, in the stillness of that restored room, silence had done its work. The cellar opened to the public on a Sunday afternoon in late August. There was no ribbon cutting, no ceremony. Just a quiet announcement in the church bulletin and a hand-painted sign that read, "Elijah's Room of Remembrance." Visitors trickled in slowly, some alone, some in pairs, many carrying memories heavier than words. The air inside was cool and still, the walls lit by soft overhead fixtures that cast gentle shadows across the stone. The space had not been transformed beyond recognition. The cot remained, the lamp untouched. The display case stood beneath the small wooden cross, holding the sermon notes, a worn Bible, and Elijah's final letter to Marlene, placed with her permission. The journal pages had been copied and bound, made available for visitors to read at a small desk tucked in the corner. A guest book rested nearby, its first page already filled with messages, some of thanks, others of apology. Reverend Gordon was among the first to enter. He stood quietly by the far wall, reading a passage Elijah had written in 1976. To love a church is to love its flaws. To speak against silence is not betrayal, it is devotion. The words struck him deeply. He had come to Clarion long after Elijah vanished, and yet he now felt tethered to him, drawn not by title or duty, but by the simple, human ache of wanting the truth to matter more than appearances. Later that afternoon, a group of teenagers from the youth group visited the cellar. They whispered at first, as if stepping into hallowed ground, but then settled into a respectful silence. One of them, a girl with a soft voice and notebook tucked under her arm, wrote in the guest book before leaving. Her message read, "Thank you for staying, even when no one saw you. I want to be that kind of brave." Outside, the cicadas buzzed low in the trees, and the sun cast long shadows over the lawn. Clarion hadn't erased what had happened, it had faced it, piece by piece, guided by the man who once walked into the dark without asking to be followed. Now, in the light, the town was learning what it meant to follow him still. In the weeks that followed, more visitors came to the cellar. Some traveled from other towns, others from distant states. Most had no direct connection to Clarion, but they came carrying stories of their own whispers of silence in places that looked like Elijah's church, wounds that had gone unseen in families that smiled for photographs. They walked slowly through the small space, pausing to read the worn script of Elijah's sermon, to study the careful folds in his journal, to sit at the desk and write in the guest book. The room had become something larger than a memorial. It was a witness. Marlene returned often, though she never stayed long. She came at dusk, usually alone, sometimes placing a flower by the cross or adjusting a lamp that didn't need adjusting. She would pause in front of the display case, her hand lightly brushing the glass, then leave before anyone else noticed she'd been there. It wasn't grief that brought her back, it was presence. She had lost her brother in the space between one Sunday and the next, but she had found him again in the silence he left behind. Sheriff Mallory, after nearly 30 years of service, announced his retirement quietly. He didn't want a ceremony or plaque. What he wanted, and what he now had, was resolution. Not the kind that ends with a gavel or a headline, but the quieter sort, the kind that settles in when you finally know you did right by someone who had once stood alone. He boxed up his files, leaving a note on the inside flap that read, "Truth waited, we listened." Reverend Gordon continued his sermons, but something had changed in his delivery. There was more stillness now, more reflection between words. He quoted Elijah from time to time, never with pomp, but as if reading from an old friend's letter. Congregants began to lean in differently, not just to hear, but to understand. The church, scarred but not broken, had become something it hadn't been in years, a place where people could speak, could ask, could remember. As autumn crept in, and the leaves along the ridge turned to rust and gold, Clarion stood a little taller. The bell tower no longer echoed with mystery, it echoed with memory. And, in that memory, Elijah Hart remained seen, heard, and finally understood. The final Sunday of the season arrived with a quiet kind of warmth, the kind that comes not from the sun, but from the way people look at each other when they've been through something hard and come out the other side changed. The sanctuary filled slowly that morning, not with spectacle, but with intention. Familiar faces, new families, visitors from far-off towns all gathered without prompting, drawn by something that felt like closure but reached deeper than that. It wasn't about ending the story. It was about carrying it forward. Reverend Gordon stood before the congregation with Elijah's sermon in his hands. The original copy had been placed back in the cellar, protected under glass, but this version, gently retyped and carefully preserved, was meant to be spoken. Not as a eulogy, not as a tribute, but as it was originally intended. A message to a community that had once sat waiting in confusion as the pulpit stood empty, unaware that the man they loved had chosen silence not out of fear but out of love too deep to risk being dismissed. The words echoed gently through the church. Elijah spoke of light not as something blinding, but as something patient, willing to wait at the edges until the door was opened. He wrote about faith that does not hide from suffering, and truth that can grow even in the dark. He asked his people not for perfection but for courage, to listen, to remember, to protect those who could not protect themselves. There were tears, of course, but there was peace too. As the final words were read, a breeze passed softly through the open windows, carrying with it the sound of leaves rustling in the trees and the faint hum of cicadas. It felt like something unseen was nodding in approval. After the service, no one rushed to leave. They lingered in the aisles, speaking in low tones, holding hands, some simply standing in stillness. Outside, the bell rang once, slow and steady, no longer a call to search, but a call to remember. And as Clarion carried on, quieter now, wiser, the story of Elijah Hart lived on not as a disappearance, but as a devotion, a life not lost, but planted. And in the town he had once served, the truth he died for had finally taken root.